It was the first time in 29 years that Johnny Carson walked onto the Tonight Show stage and didn't smile. July 15, 1991. 3 weeks after his son Rick died. 3 weeks after a phone call that shattered everything. 3 weeks after learning that your success, your fame, your career, none of it matters when your child is gone. The audience didn't know what to do. Should they applaud? Stay silent? Give him space? They chose to applaud, softly, respectfully, like you applaud at a funeral, not a TV show. Johnny sat at his desk, no opening joke, no witty remark. He just sat there for a moment, looking at the audience, looking at the camera, looking like a man who'd forgotten how to pretend. "I'm not going to do jokes tonight," Johnny said, his voice barely steady. "I just need to talk about something, about my son." And then, for 12 minutes, the king of late night stopped being a king and became a father. A grieving, broken father who didn't know how to keep going but was trying anyway. He talked about Rick, about being a father who was never there enough, about regret, about loss, about how success means nothing when you lose someone you love. He cried on camera. Johnny Carson, who never showed weakness, cried in front of 30 million people. And those 30 million people cried with him, because in that moment, Johnny stopped being the untouchable late-night legend and became something more important. Human, flawed, broken, real. And in his brokenness, he gave permission to every parent, every person who'd lost someone, to admit that grief doesn't have a timeline, that there's no getting over it, that sometimes all you can do is show up and be honest about how much it hurts. June 21, 1991, 1:25 in the morning. The phone rang in Johnny Carson's Malibu home. No one calls at 1:25 a.m. with good news. Johnny's middle son, Rick Carson, had been driving on Highway 108 in the Sierra Nevada mountains. A photographer, he'd been coming home from a shoot. The road was dark, winding, dangerous. Rick's car went off the road, down an embankment. The car rolled multiple times. Rick was 39 years old. He didn't survive. Rick Carson was one of Johnny's 3 sons from his first marriage to Jody Wolcott, the marriage that ended in 1963, back when Johnny was just starting to make it big. Johnny wasn't a good father. He'd be the first to admit it, though he rarely did publicly. His career came first, always. The late nights, the travel, the relentless focus on being the best. It didn't leave much room for being a dad. Rick grew up mostly without him. Saw his father on TV more than in person, had a famous last name, but not much of a relationship with the man behind it. As an adult, Rick became a photographer, talented, quiet, living his own life away from his father's spotlight. They weren't estranged exactly, just distant, the way fathers and sons can be when there's too much history and not enough time. Johnny had always told himself there'd be time later, time to fix things. Time to be the father he hadn't been when Rick was young. But on June 21, 1991, time ran out. The Tonight Show went dark immediately. Guest hosts filled in. The official statement was vague. Johnny is taking time for personal reasons. But in an industry where everyone knows everything, word got out fast. Johnny's son had died. The details were whispered in green rooms and production offices. The king of late night, the man who'd made America laugh for 29 years, was dealing with something that no amount of fame could protect him from. Those 3 weeks were the longest Johnny had been off the air in nearly 3 decades. Even during contract negotiations, even during the bitter fights with NBC, Johnny had shown up. The show always went on, but not this time. Friends who called said Johnny was destroyed, not sad, not grieving in any manageable way, just destroyed. Sitting in his house, unable to process that his son was gone, and wrestling with something even worse than grief, guilt. Johnny kept asking the same question. Was I a good enough father? He knew the answer. He'd known it for years. But knowing it and losing your chance to fix it are 2 very different things. Johnny had missed Rick's childhood, missed birthdays and baseball games and school plays. He'd been too busy building a career, becoming a legend, making millions of strangers laugh. And now Rick was gone. And Johnny would never get another chance to be the father he should have been. That's the thing about death. It doesn't just take someone. It takes every future conversation you might have had, every apology you might have made, every moment you kept postponing because you thought there'd always be more time. Johnny had spent 3 decades being perfect on television, controlled, composed, the professional who never let personal problems show. But this wasn't a problem he could perform his way through. After 3 weeks, Johnny decided to come back. Not because he was ready, not because the grief had lessened, but because he knew that if he waited until he was ready, he'd never come back at all. The producers were worried. "Johnny, take more time. Come back when you can do the show properly." But Johnny knew there was no properly. His son was dead. That wasn't going to change. He could stay home and hide, or he could show up and be honest. He chose honest. But he made one decision that shocked everyone. He was going to talk about Rick, on air, in front of 30 million people. His team tried to talk him out of it. "Johnny, you don't have to do this. Nobody expects you to address it. Just do your monologue, tell some jokes, give America what they're used to." Johnny shook his head. "I can't pretend he didn't exist. I can't just go out there and act like everything's fine when my son is dead." "Then don't do jokes. But you don't have to talk about it either. Your private life is private." Johnny looked at them with eyes that hadn't slept much in 3 weeks. "I've spent 29 years keeping my private life private. And you know what that got me? A son I barely knew. I'm not doing that anymore." The Tonight Show audience that night knew something was different the moment Johnny walked out. No smile, no wave, no Johnny Carson charm. He looked older, thinner, tired in a way that went deeper than missed sleep. The audience applauded, but it was quiet, uncertain. They knew about Rick by now. The news had leaked. They were applauding because they didn't know what else to do. Johnny sat at his desk, looked at the camera, and for the first time in 29 years, he had no idea what to say. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, real. Then Johnny spoke. "I'm not going to do jokes tonight. I need to talk about something." The audience was dead silent. 3 weeks ago, my son Rick died in a car accident. He was 39 years old. Johnny's voice cracked. He paused, trying to compose himself, failing. "I've been doing this show for 29 years, and I've always kept my personal life separate. That was the deal. You guys get the jokes, the show, the entertainment, and I keep the personal stuff private." He looked down at his desk, took a breath. "But I can't do that tonight, because my son is gone, and I need to talk about him." What happened next wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed. Johnny just talked. He talked about Rick, about how talented he was as a photographer, how quiet and thoughtful, how he'd chosen a life away from the spotlight because he wanted to be his own person. Rick never wanted to be known as Johnny Carson's son, Johnny said. He wanted to be Rick, just Rick, and I respected that. Maybe too much. Maybe I kept my distance because I thought that's what he wanted. Johnny's voice broke again. He wiped his eyes. "The truth is, I wasn't a very good father. I was too focused on this." He gestured to the stage, the cameras, the show, on being Johnny Carson, on the career. "And my kids, they grew up without me being there much." The camera stayed on Johnny's face. No cutaway, no mercy. Just a man crying on national television. You tell yourself there'll be time later, time to fix the mistakes, time to have the conversations you should have had years ago. And then one morning you get a phone call and you realize there is no later. Time's up. The audience was crying now too, not just a few people, everyone. The crew, the camera operators, Ed McMahon sitting at his desk was openly sobbing. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Johnny said, trying to smile through tears. "I guess because I spent 29 years pretending I had it all together. And I don't. I'm just a guy who lost his son and doesn't know how to process it." He looked directly into the camera. "If you have kids, hug them tonight. Don't wait. Don't think there'll be time later. Do it now." The Tonight Show switchboard lit up immediately. Thousands of calls, then tens of thousands. People calling to share their own grief, to say they'd lost someone too, to thank Johnny for being honest. But more than that, people calling to say they were going to call their kids, their parents, the people they'd been meaning to reach out to but kept putting off. Johnny had done something unprecedented. He'd taken the nation's grief, all the accumulated loss and regret that people carry around, and given it permission to exist, to be acknowledged, to be felt. For 29 years, Johnny Carson had been the man who made America feel better. That night, he made America feel. Period. Johnny came back to work after that night, did the show for another year before retiring in 1992. But people who knew him said he was never quite the same. The guilt over Rick never left him. The what-ifs, the might-have-beens, the conversations he'd never have. In his retirement, Johnny became more private than ever. But those who stayed in touch said he'd changed in one important way. He called his other two sons more, spent more time with them, tried in whatever way he could to be present. It was too late for Rick, but maybe not too late for his brothers. Here's what Johnny never talked about publicly. Rick's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mirror. It forced Johnny to look at what he'd sacrificed for success, the relationships he'd neglected, the family he'd put second to his career, the price of being the king of late night. Johnny had everything the world said mattered: fame, money, respect, a place in television history. But his son was gone, and all that success felt hollow. That's what those 12 minutes were really about. Not just grief over Rick, but grief over all the years Johnny couldn't get back, all the moments he'd missed, all the ways he'd failed at the thing that mattered most. Johnny Carson died in 2005. At his funeral, his son Chris spoke about that night in July 1991. "My dad spent his whole career being perfect on TV," Chris said. "Never slipping up, never showing weakness. But the night he came back after Rick died, he wasn't perfect. He was just Dad. And that's the version of him I'll remember most. Not the Tonight Show host, just the man who loved his son and wished he'd done better." That 12-minute segment became one of the most replayed clips in Tonight Show history. Not because it was funny or entertaining, but because it was real. It showed that success doesn't protect you from pain, that fame doesn't make grief hurt less, that even the people who seem to have it all together are often barely holding on. Here's what that night taught America. It's okay to not be okay. For decades, the culture had been about putting on a good face, keeping your pain private, not burdening others with your problems. Johnny had been the perfect example of that philosophy, always composed, always professional. But that night, Johnny shattered that expectation. He showed that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you're broken. That vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. After Johnny's appearance, grief counselors reported a massive increase in people seeking help. Fathers calling to reconnect with sons. Adult children reaching out to aging parents. Johnny's honesty had given people permission to acknowledge their own pain, to stop pretending everything was fine, to be human. If Johnny had been able to talk to Rick one more time, what would he have said? Probably the same thing he said on television that night. "I'm sorry. I wasn't there enough. I put my career first, and you deserved better." But here's the thing about grief. You never get that one last conversation. You never get to say the things you meant to say. That's what makes loss so devastating. All you can do is what Johnny did. Show up. Be honest. Try to do better with whoever you have left. We live in a world obsessed with success, with climbing higher, achieving more, being the best. We tell ourselves we're doing it for our families, for our kids, to give them a better life. But Johnny Carson had ultimate success, and his son still died without really knowing his father. That's not a condemnation of Johnny. It's a reminder that success without connection is empty, that fame without love is meaningless, that all the achievements in the world don't matter if you're not present for the people who need you. Johnny spent 29 years being the king of late night. But on July 15, 1991, he stopped being a king and became something more important. A father who loved his son and wished he'd shown it better. At the end of that 12-minute segment, Johnny looked into the camera one last time. "I don't know why I shared all this with you," he said, wiping his eyes. "Maybe just because I needed to say it out loud, to admit that I wasn't good enough, that I failed." He paused. But if you're out there right now and you're thinking about calling someone you love but keep putting it off, call them. Don't wait. because you don't know how much time you have. 30 million people were watching, and in homes across America, people picked up their phones. That's Johnny's real legacy. Not the 4,531 episodes, not the legendary interviews, but 12 minutes when he stopped performing and started being human. 12 minutes when he admitted he was broken, and in doing so, helped heal a nation. If this story moved you, take a moment right now, call someone you love, tell them what they mean to you. Don't wait for later. Johnny Carson learned the hard way that later doesn't always come. Subscribe for more stories about the human moments behind the legends. Hit that notification bell and share this with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to not be okay, that grief is real, that regret is real, and that the bravest thing we can do is show up and be honest about it. Because in the end, we're all just trying to do better, to love better, to be present before it's too late. Johnny couldn't save Rick, but in his grief, he saved thousands of relationships by reminding people what really matters. Don't wait. Call them now.